Hello, I'm Annette Heisdorffer, the Daviess County Extension Agent for Horticulture Education. Today, our topic is extending vegetable gardening into the fall. The benefits of fall gardening include extending the season, of course, to produce more food. And of course, during our time of the pandemic, this is important for our families to make sure that we are secure in our food supply. And then it's also great to be able to share food with others. Good quality vegetables with fall warm days and cool nights. This adds sugar to the cold crops, so our broccoli is really good during the fall as well as cabbage. And then with row covers, we can extend the season of those frost-sensitive crops, possibly into the winter. Then two things we are going to learn today include timing for the last planting of warm season crops and cool season crops that can withstand the frost, which will be growing in the fall. A question comes, is it too early? We're just at the 1st of June. And it seems like we've just planted some of our vegetables and they're not producing yet. But as far as if it's not too early or not, depends on our location. Since this presentation is throughout our Commonwealth, we have to look at the different regions of our Commonwealth. For example, in Western Kentucky, where I'm located, our average frost date, free date, would be around April 20th to 30th. Of course, this year was an exception, but as far as when we go across to the other end of the state, our Commonwealth, May 5th through the 10th may be the last killing frost. So with that consideration, we have to begin thinking about our fall gardening, especially as we come into the Eastern Kentucky. In Eastern Kentucky, we can plant another crop of tomatoes by June 1st. Out in Western Kentucky, it would be July 1st. So as I was beginning to do this presentation, I thought it needed to be done earlier to give everyone across our Commonwealth a chance to learn about fall gardening and extending that season. For us in this area, we can go up to August 1st for planting green beans through succession planting, and even summer squash. Then the latest safe date to plant our cool season crops to be able to make sure we can get a harvest before it freezes are these particular dates listed from our vegetable growing so-called Bible, Home Gardening in Kentucky. So we need to be thinking about cabbage in Eastern Kentucky planted by plants by July 1st. In Western Kentucky, we have up until August 1st. This needs to give us some time, if we start our own transplants, to know when we need to get those going. This guide is a great guide because I hadn't even thought about planting radishes up through even October 1st until doing this presentation. Again, when to plant depends on your microclimate. You may have a situation where in pots or in a raised bed, or even in your garden where you may warm up earlier or you may stay warmer later than other locations and then other people as well. Fences also make areas warmer. And if you're up against a house, again, you're going to have a warmer location and you can garden longer. As well, if you're having a question about the weather in your area and how long to extend your garden without any kind of cover, ask your local extension agents about that because they can help you. And this slide shows the URL at the bottom where you can go to contact your office if you don't know how to reach them. So some consideration for fall gardening includes days to maturity. We want to make sure we're choosing varieties that are earlier maturing. Remember that cooler temperatures slow down maturity. Don't forget about the size and growth habit of the plant because it may outgrow your garden. Disease resistance is important because disease pressure increases as our growing season continues. Think about insect pressure and heat tolerance. Look for some lettuce varieties that tolerate the heat. There may be some green bean varieties too that set flower better in the heat as well. Remember to rotate your crops. Avoid those closely related crops because we want to reduce the amount of insect and disease buildup, and rotate away from those crops for 3 years. So for example, beets, Swiss chard, and spinach are in the same family. So if I planted spinach this spring, I don't want to go right back to that spot and plant spinach this fall. Then cabbage, and in that particular family of the brassicas, we don't want to put those together as well or plant right back in the same spot. Potatoes, eggplant, tomatoes, peppers, very common vegetables, but those are all in the same family. And then the pumpkins and the squash, cucumbers, muskmelons, that's another family. So rotate between the families. As we're planning our garden, we are thinking about the spring, which we've already planted, and summer, and then into our fall. So we just reviewed some of those earliest and latest planting dates, but that table is a really great table, again, to show some of the other vegetables that we can plant and the timings that we start and we can finish. For the examples, the spring and fall cabbage and broccoli plantings are great. You really want to break up some of those plantings. We wouldn't want to grow it in the summer as well. One reason it doesn't do as well for those crops, but the second reason is to prevent the buildup of insects. The cool season crops, they tolerate a light frost. Those are the cabbage, the broccoli, the lettuce, our kales, collards, snow peas, Swiss chard. Those are the crops that we're definitely going to plant for fall. But don't forget to plant again, the succession planting of our warm season crops that do not tolerate a frost, including those cucumbers, all the way through peppers and eggplants and green beans. So with season extension, those include the succession planting of both the warm season and the cool season crop. We have an opportunity then to continue to grow through the fall. When we have a frost with the warm season crops, you might consider a high tunnel or row covers, because this would give you a chance to get through the fall first light frost. And then we seem to get a little bit of warm weather after that, so you can get, again, an extended season. Row covers are great to use, especially with the cold crops, to get those even into the winter time. Again, remember, for the succession planting, we still have some time in most of our regions for some of the main crops that might go into your garden. When we're talking again about the latest safe planting day for those cool season crops, use this as your guide as to decide, when do I need to put that spinach in, or do I have time yet? Sometimes our calendar gets away from us, and then it comes September 1st, and I think, well, can I still plant spinach safely and get a crop? And yes, we can here in Western Kentucky, up until September 15th. High tunnels are like greenhouses, but they don't have any heat in them. In the summer, it does get hot in those high tunnels. So making sure that we have roll down sides is important. But starting some of those crops in the fall or late summer gives us a chance then to bring them into part of the very early winter before our light quality drops off. For our home gardens, many times just using row covers is all that we need. These are examples of using raised beds with PVC pipe. It could also be with a stiff wire that you could use to hold up the plastic. The key though is to make sure you have a vented area. You could also use these row covers then to plant late and keep the crop over the winter. This year, the winter was so mild that I was able to keep this kale going through the winter. There's also in our book for the vegetable guide for homeowners an example of a row cover that is slitted. And I like the slit row cover because all of our lives get busy, and some days when the sun's out, I don't remember to vent it. As a reminder, there are some of our vegetables that we need to start by transplants. So give yourself plenty of time for the fall garden to be able to get those transplants started. Examples are your tomatoes and cabbage. You can do the squash. It only takes about a couple of weeks to transplant, but in a garden at this time of year, I just direct seed. Another key is hardening off those plants, making sure they get 1 to 2 weeks of hardening off before we put it out into the garden. Reduce the water and fertilizer. Don't let the plants dry out, but we want to not have so much moisture available so that they're happy all the time, but don't let them wilt. During the growing season, put on the mulch for the temperature purposes to keep the moisture into the soil, as well as reduce competition by weeds. And we can use the organic material like straw or inorganic like plastics and fabric or newspaper. For weed management, don't bring the weed seeds in. That's one of the first steps, if at all possible. Then the other key is don't let them go to seed, or you'll have them for what seems like forever. And control the weeds around the garden edge and landscape to reduce the insect pressure and also to avoid having weed seeds coming back in your garden. During the growing season for a pre-plant, when you have already grown a crop and removed that other crop, apply about 1 pound of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square feet if you had fertilized according to your soil test. In our booklet, according to table 17, you can find out how to side dress your crops for better production. During the season 2, we want to make sure that we have 1 inch of water per week. Make sure you're wetting the soil and not the plant. Cool of the morning is the best time, and using drip irrigation. And in the morning too, but then we don't have as much evaporation if we have to do it during the middle of the day. As we go along in our fall gardening, diseases and insects can increase, and then we have a situation where we need to continue to scout for insect pests and diseases. Check the underside of the leaves, because sometimes we know these insects hide. And for example, a pest is spider mites, and these particular spider mites usually are many times on the undersides of the leaves. Proper identification is key to managing these pests, and of course, contact your local extension agent for help. First thing to use always when managing these particular diseases and insects would be cultural practices. When you are finished with the plants, remove that plant debris. Right now, it seems like, well, I don't have any space in my garden for the next fall crop. But one key may be, even though we want to get every tomato off the plant or every green bean off the plant that we can, there comes a point when the plant is not as productive. It's best to harvest those beans, and hopefully we've planted early enough that we're now ready to harvest our next crop. So make sure when those plants are done or have a lot of disease or insect pressure, remove them and destroy them. A good tip is always good air circulation, and for the fall, especially disease-resistant varieties. There are a lot of other cultural practices listed in our booklet, and I would suggest that it's a great place to visit to remind yourself about these particular practices. For the management of these disease and insects, again, look at the label. And for diseases, Only use a fungicide when needed. Fungicides, remember, are protectants, so apply no later than the first symptom of disease. If we allow the disease to keep going on, we don't get it identified, and then we try to stop it, many times it's impossible. Good coverage is needed on the underside of the leaves too for the fungicides. And another key I find is that it gets confusing. Should I apply the fungicide before the rain or after the rain? The fungicide needs to go on before the rain. It needs to protect the plant so that the spore can't get into the plant. Yes, some of it will be washed off, but then you can just do a tighter schedule according to what the label allows you. Always apply the pesticides according to the label. Insecticides can be applied though after the pests are present. So it's a little different than with diseases. Diseases are protectants. For insecticides, we can catch up a little bit. Follow the number of waiting days before harvest as stated on the pesticide label. And if you don't find that, it's possibly not a product labeled for use on that particular vegetable plant. All of this information applies for both organic and non-organic pesticides. Some of the key pests that you may find in the fall are the cabbage looper, and these are on, of course, the cabbage and the broccoli and the cole crops. The diamondback moth, this particular larva, that is also one that you may find, and it does some window painting. Management of these pests, again, are found in our booklet or contact your agent. Another insect pest to be scouting for is squash bug, and the key to controlling the squash bug is to control it early. You can, when you see these little golden football-like eggs on the leaves, mark it with the flag, and sometimes if you can go ahead and remove it beforehand, that's great. But if you have a lot of squash plants, mark it, and when they hatch, then that is the time to manage it with an insecticide. The brown stink bug creates this type of damage on tomatoes and peppers, the white kind of cloudy looking material. Stink bugs can be pretty difficult. You usually don't see them, but watch your tomatoes or peppers for this damage, especially when they're green. Many times we find that's when they do their piercing and sucking mouth part into the fruit and causes the damage. In Western Kentucky, we've not really seen a lot of brown marmorated stink bug. It would cause the damage shown in the previous slide, but we will see more damage in this area. In Central Kentucky and possibly Eastern Kentucky, you've seen more damage by this particular stink bug. When you're scouting, look for some of the frass. And this is what comes out the back end of the insect after it is finished eating. And when you see this frass, keep looking hard because that tomato hornworm is hiding somewhere. To remove the hornworm, it's just best I like to take a pair of pliers with me and remove it off. Another insect pest that becomes very challenging is the cucumber beetles, whether the striped or the spotted cucumber beetle, and they carry a bacteria which causes the bacterial wilt in the cucumber. So one day your plant looks wonderful, the next day it's collapsed. That's why succession planting is really good with cucumbers. Aphids have been plentiful as well, so always watch for aphids. Thinking about all this insect management, we're looking at integrated pest management. When does an insect really become a problem? One tomato hornworm probably isn't that much of a problem. It can just be removed by hand. So you have to know your tolerance level, your time and energy and money that you want to spend on your crop. Know the tolerance of the plant as well. Is it defoliated completely or is tunneling a problem? What's the age of the plant? That's why succession planting is a good idea. As the plant gets older, it may not be worth trying to manage all of the insects on it. Like a green bean, it may not be producing as well. So it's time to move on to the next planting. So in insect management, we're going to hand pick, use insecticidal soaps or as an option for some of the management. We can think of horticultural oil and Bacillus thuringiensis. Sometimes we just call it BP products. So the ways to protect our pollinators when we're using insecticides is don't spray if you don't have to. Select sprays safe for pollinators. Mow off flower heads before spraying if you have a clover next to the garden. And spray in the evening after 6 p.m. when our pollinators have left many of our flowers, such as the cucumbers, the flowers on the squash have closed, and that's a good time to spray after 6 p.m. For more information, contact your local extension agent, the Home Vegetable Gardening Guide in Kentucky, and then the resources too from our Department of Entomology. For diseases, we still run into blossom end rot, especially when the soil moisture is not consistent. So we need to use a mulch for that. Tomato early blight usually is always in our gardens. Getting rid of the plant debris is important. The lesion on the left is a close-up of where the spore had set in the center, is where it had landed and infected the plant tissue. And you can see the target spotting as that particular fungal disease continues to expand. It's usually found on the lower part of the plant first. So picking those leaves off early helps out with the inoculum, but later in the season, you may not be able to keep up with that type of program. Usually with the early blight is also the septoria. It has the gray spots in the center of the lesions. Of course, powdery mildew, as we especially get into August, when all we need is humidity. Squash seems to be one of those that I always find powdery mildew on in the vegetable garden. Bacterial wilt of cucumbers, we had just mentioned that as far as the insect with the bacteria, with the beetle. But if you take the stems, cut them apart, gently push them together, and then draw them out, you may find the little stream of bacteria that is clogging the conducting tissue for the food and water. For more disease information, again, go to our agents, our book, and then our University of Kentucky resources through plant pathology. Also mentioning a little more about pesticide safety. Do not apply a pesticide at a dosage greater than listed on the label. Don't apply any pesticide on a type of plant not covered on the label. And again, don't apply a pesticide more often than what the label says. And never have a person under 18 apply the pesticides. With this today, I hope that brought some ideas to you or reminded you about gardening into the fall. And even though it seems early, planning now is important, and allow yourself to plant some extras so that you can start getting rid of some of the older plants when they're not producing as well.